It's an honor to be here. You're my people. We're producers. We all grow stuff. And the legacy of Terry Gomper is carried on in this first ever Northeast Grass-Fed Exchange Conference. It's proud, makes me proud to be part of that legacy. Most people who know me know that most of my life I've been trying to figure out how to grow topsoil. For about 15 years I was trying to figure out how to build topsoil. And then one morning I woke up and I said, well, I grow plants, I grow livestock, I grow tomatoes, but I've never built plants, pastures, livestock. I grow topsoil. And it'll become more apparent why this focus on growing topsoil, because we need to merge the biological infrastructure of our working landscapes with our built infrastructure as part of where we're heading. So myself, Dr. John Norman and Gabe Brown have co-founded a company called Landstream. And we are making tools to help people grow deep topsoil watersheds and quantify the value that results when you have deep topsoil watersheds and the rain soaks in and you're harvesting a lot of solar energy to run that landscape engine on all 8 cylinders, so to speak. This photograph is just taken. I climb Mount Philo every now and then. It's a few minutes from my house, and this is the view. It's a beautiful landscape. It's a beautiful place. It's a fragile paradise. It's one that, unfortunately, beautiful though it may be, is actually a skeleton of a landscape operating on a fraction of the topsoil it had only 200 years ago. And it's my intention to leave my daughter a deep topsoil landscape. And in fact, I think that there are 2 primary options in the near term in front of us. One is to leave the next generation deep topsoil watersheds, and the other is to not. And the question becomes, which are you going to do? In order to get there, in all these years of working to figure out how to grow topsoil and realizing at the farm scale, on other farms, realizing, wow, we actually need this to scale for it to have an impact. It became clear that the watershed was the logical unit. Now, watersheds range, of course, from a mud puddle to the Mississippi. And I'll talk about the scale of watersheds I think are very useful to begin thinking and acting at that scale. I want to read briefly from a book by Louis Bromfield, though. This was written in 1955 called From My Experience. A chapter in here that I love, written in 1955, is on building topsoil 10,000 times faster than nature. 1955. Another chapter in here is How to Make a Paradise, and it's about planning and working at the watershed scale. And Louis had to say that it was inevitable that the progression of the whole program for conserving our natural resources should begin with the individual farm, then progress into the stage of the soil conservation districts, in which many farmers in a neighborhood or county practice cooperation, and move finally into the development of the watershed unit, embracing not only agricultural units, but cities and towns as well. The whole is the upland and the farms and the ranches and the forests and the city and the taxpayers and the farmers and the non-farmers working together as a whole. So I'm going to talk briefly about some tools that we've been developing, one in particular, that we think are necessary to help people grow deep topsoil watersheds. The first is just recognizing that we live in a world covered in watersheds, and they are holes within holes within holes within holes, all the way, for example, up to, I think, the 4th largest watershed in the world, the Mississippi, which is 40% of the lower 48 states in the United States. I want to also note that soil aggregates, aggregated topsoil as a whole across the landscape, this porous, living medium called topsoil, which is half space, is our primary infrastructure. It's the biodiversity and that aggregated topsoil. And that aggregated topsoil, the only thing that can aggregate topsoil, generate the glues, penetrate, glue it all together, put it into big crumbs, little crumbs, and lots of pore spaces, is life. Roots, microorganisms, organisms. It's our fundamental infrastructure. And the interesting thing about it is you actually can't build it. You can't till soil and create aggregates. Only life can organically structure into an aggregated porous medium. And so it has to be grown, and it has to be continually grown. Who can grow that topsoil, that infrastructure? Farmers, ranchers, slower, but not to be dismissed, foresters and so forth. So topsoil is our fundamental infrastructure. In fact, we have a giant on-earth infrastructure project ahead of us, and that is growing topsoil infrastructure. I forgot to start my timer. If I don't track myself, I get off. You know how it is. Plants, animals, and healthy aggregated topsoil are also the source of ecosystem services. Now this is interesting. People are probably familiar with this concept of ecosystem services. If you look at this image, the diagram came from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and it's important because what it shows is that all of the ecosystem services, from provisioning, food, fiber, fuel, those are ecosystem services to human beings from nature. So are the regulating ecosystem services: climate regulation, flood regulation, disease regulation, purification of water at a whole landscape scale, and all the cultural benefits we get as well. They all come from plants growing, nutrient cycling, and topsoil forming continually. And that comes from our management, for example. We now know, I'm confident, through my own experience, that of my colleagues, that we can grow topsoil quite rapidly. Topsoil is a renewable resource. So if all these ecosystem services come from topsoil, isn't it interesting that for probably about 10,000 years, we've basically been paying farmers for one ecosystem service: food, fuel and fiber as well, yes. But we've been paying for one. What are the consequences? We've externalized the other ecosystem services: the flood regulation, the atmospheric regulation, the water purification. And what are the consequences? Well, look around. We have about 60 years of soil left on Earth on average. We have a lot of polluted water. We have a lot of flooding. We're in the 6th extinction event. These are colossal global challenges that are not easy to swoop out of, but we have to. So the consequence of paying for only one ecosystem service is that we've externalized and valued at zero all the others, and the consequences are all around us, and it's a dear price that we're basically passing to our kids unless we choose not to. I'm from Vermont. In Vermont in 1830, a man named Thaddeus Fairbanks, a hemp farmer and a blacksmith, invented the platform scale. It revolutionized the industrial and agricultural revolutions of the time. It allowed farmers and anyone who produced anything to rapidly and accurately weigh their production. It turned out that this technology, this scale, this ability to rapidly and accurately weigh production transformed economics worldwide and how we've interacted with the land and each other and everything. Now, going back a little further than that to about 4,000 years ago is when the first balance scales were invented. The earliest instances have been found in Pakistan and Lebanon, what are today those countries. Before the advent of the balance scale, we did not have banking. If you think about the earliest forms of currency, the shekel was actually a unit of weight of barley. Money and agricultural production and the ability to quantify agricultural production go right back to the beginning of economics. And we have an opportunity now in front of us to transform economics and transform agricultural production. And so what we've been working on, I'll loosely call it a new scale. And the new scale, instead of just measuring food, wood, and fiber and fuel, now we have designed a system that is able to quantify how much you, as a producer, create flooding reduction, groundwater recharge, clean water, reduce drought, infrastructure protection, like our reservoirs, our roads, our bridges, and so forth. It's more complex by a long shot, but our intention is that this tool will become cheaper and cheaper, more and more readily available, and basically allow all of us to greatly diversify our production such that cities, companies, communities, taxpayers in general will be able to hire us to grow them deep topsoil watershed and all the security and ecosystem services that come along with it. And in so hiring us, save themselves a fortune. So land managers, we are the 1% who can grow topsoil and biodiversity, the fundamental infrastructure that we need right now at this moment. Our communities and governments, I want them to hire us to grow these deep topsoil watersheds. We need to measure our production of critical environmental services. We need to be based on quantified production, not practices. What other industry pays people based really on practices? Oh, you have a factory and 500 employees, here's $1 billion. And yet, in the current regime and various regulatory programs and current payment for ecosystem services, oh, you have a riparian buffer, oh, you have this or that, we'll help you pay for it and whatnot. We're being paid on practices when it comes to environmental services, and that is the most ineffective way that I could imagine doing that. We're not being paid based on practices is nonsensical. The thing that's been holding us back is we haven't had a way to measure the actual production of these ecosystem services because we have the full complexity of nature in effect, and quantifying it, frankly, 10 years ago, I couldn't have made this talk. We didn't have the tools. I think that some of the consequences of cities hiring farmers to grow deep topsoil watersheds and the resulting ecosystem services are that we can double farmers' incomes. Then we can have taxpayers' expenses related to natural resource problems, disaster mitigation, infrastructure maintenance, insurance, and perhaps reduction of bloated regulatory agencies. Aldo Leopold, such an important figure in thinking about conservation and the economics of regeneration, just called conservation at that time. We know now that we can't just conserve what we have. We don't have enough left anymore just to conserve. We have to regenerate it. He said that conservation will ultimately boil down to rewarding the private landowner who conserves the public interest. In 2008, Forbes published this rather, I think, important article. We've learned a lot since then. And it was called The $8 Billion Bargain, How Watershed Payments Save Cities, Support Farms, and Combat Climate Change. And you can see that upstream, the land management ecosystem service benefits that flow downstream to, for example, the city at the bottom of the watershed, is matched by payments from the city. And in the language of that day, just a few short years ago, this was thought of in terms of incentives, subsidies, and so forth, rather than straightforward supply and demand markets with quantified production, which is what I am advocating for. But this was a step in the right direction. Regenerative economics is too large a topic to tackle in this talk, but this is what we are after. We want our daily economic activity, the money we spend, our purchasing decisions, how our economy is structured to generate new topsoil and new biodiversity as an automatic incidental outcome. That structure is obviously very different than the economy that we have today. If we're going to have regenerative economics, we need ecological accounting, in which we quantify what happens to solar energy. Where does it go? Does it go to heating the soil, heating the water to transpiration, to soil evaporation, photosynthesis? We need to quantify it on a physics basis, completely and totally. Water budgets, same way. How much is soaking in? Because that really is the crux of so many of these ecosystem services. Is the water running off or soaking in? Once it soaks in, is it held? Is it purified and slowly released? Or does it drain straight through carrying nitrates to our groundwater, for example? So energy budgets, water budgets, nutrient budgets, and biodiversity are the basics of this ecological accounting. Nutrient budgets actually are very complicated. A very important nutrient budget is carbon. And one simple way to track it that is certainly included in our new scale is measuring soil carbon change to depth accurately across landscapes. There are many other, but in a way, if we have this energy budgets and water budgets, that gives us a platform for all of these scientists who really we farmers should give them a way to be more gainfully employed, and they can do the deep research on various nutrient budgeting. And that's very valuable. We actually need a reunion of our academic community that's more led by our communities and us agriculture and people living in the watersheds. So this budgeting is a critical piece of it all. I'm going to return now home to Vermont, where I'm from, Lake Champlain, and of the 5.3 million acres there, we have 1 million acres of farmland. Those 1 million acres of farmland are a pretty amazing opportunity to regrow the topsoil that frankly we've squandered as we built our civilization. Charles Kellogg in the 38 USDA Yearbook of Ag asked, do civilizations fall because the soils fail to produce? Or does the soil fail only when the people living on it no longer know how to manage their civilization? We don't know how to manage our civilization, or at least it's not apparent from the rate of soil loss, environmental resource degradation, and so forth that accompanies normal economic activity right now. One clear illustration of this began in the early 1800s, 1810. We had a sheep craze in Vermont, and most of the trees were cut down, much of New England for that matter. It produced enormous wealth. The town of Wethersfield, Vermont became the wealthiest town in the United States in the mid-1800s based on sheep income. It's how we built our magnificent state house and our society. We as a society did this based on clearing our land, cashing it on the soil, and we lost about half our soil into our waterways. 1927, much of the land was still cleared. A flood, the flood of 1927, killed 84 people and caused $440 million in damage. I live in this building, so you can be assured that I watch the weather. Today, we have a total maximum daily load, new set of regulations, because Lake Champlain is filled with algae, nutrients, phosphorus, nitrogen, and is quickly eutrophying. It's a magnificent lake, and it is dying. And algae is a bad scenario. Algae, blue-green algae, it turns out is producing a neurotoxin called BMAA. There are clusters of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, and other neurodegenerative brain diseases wherever there's blue-green algae. This is something to think about. We abuse the land, she gets rid of us. We plan to spend $1 billion in Vermont cleaning up the phosphorus problem over the next 20 years. That's an enormous expense, and that's just to deal with a pollution problem, not to achieve the deep topsoil watersheds. 8 to 11 inches of rainfall in 2011 was Tropical Storm Irene, $733 million in damage. I grew up playing in that house, walking on these roads, playing under that bridge, driving down these roads, driving past this farmland. It was devastating to Vermont. Any decent soil should be able to infiltrate 11 inches of rain in 24 hours. We do not, despite the greenery and beauty of the landscape, in fact, we are living on the skeleton of a landscape, and we need to grow deep topsoil watersheds to leave our children. That's what I intend to do. And when I say pass it to the next generation, I mean precisely that. I've got 40 or 50 years left on Earth. My daughter's 14 years old. I'm going to leave her a working deep topsoil watershed, or I'm not going to, and I choose the former. The Gulf of Mexico dead zone, I'm going to take us big for a quick minute. If you think about the Gulf of Mexico dead zone, which is the largest ever this year, which is an outcome of sediment, phosphorus, nitrogen, and other nutrients running down the Mississippi and all its tributaries, most people in this room would say, well, to fix that, we basically have to make the rain soak in to healthy land upstream in the entire tributary. And I would say that you are right. And if you think about the immensity of that, 40% of the lower 48, think of the thousands and thousands of farms and communities and cities and economies and the regeneration and revival and creativity and renewal. I know a lot of communities in this region. There are towns dying, agriculture collapsing, soil's gone, a lot of poverty and so forth. That can all be reversed, and it can be done by paying farmers, hiring farmers to grow us these deep topsoil watersheds. New York City, largest unfiltered water system in the United States. 9 million people. We're right here in the Albany area. Am I in the right spot there? I think right here in the Albany area. And there are a couple of watersheds there, and that water is collected in reservoirs and piped through huge underground canals, pipes, aqueducts to New York City. In '89, when the EPA passed regulations that said the water has to be this clean, there was one big option. That was to build an $8 billion water treatment plant and then operate those treatment plants at a cost of about $1 million a day. They've spent on the order of about a tenth of that, and they've achieved the clean water, and they did it by investing in the watershed. It's a good example of how we can invest in watersheds and save taxpayers money. They've become a water exporting region. More than 140 US cities are considering watershed conservation instead of building filtration plants. Consider that market research. Those people need you to grow them deep topsoil watersheds. Now I'm going to zoom in right close. Here's a series of hydrological unit code 12 watersheds in Delaware, in Pennsylvania on the Delaware, quite a bit south of us, another 4 hours south of us. And there we see the Huck 12 watersheds. And here we see some third order watersheds, much smaller, about 5,400 acres on this one. This is the Honey Hollow watershed, which I have the honor of working on. And that was the first, in 1939, that was the first Soil Conservation Service watershed that was ever undertaken as a community project. 6 farmers came together and agreed to work on the watershed together and achieve some amazing things. And part of the inspiration for that Louis Bromfield quote came from that watershed. That's about 5,400 acres. There used to be some number of dozens of farms in that. Is that a workable scale? There's a little village right about here, close down, low on the stream, which is where most villages in the Northeast are, at the bottom of a good third order stream near the river. Think about it. Could we cooperate with the city and a couple dozen farmers in a watershed and turn that 5,400 acre bit of land into a paradise?
For sure.
Yes? Can we do this? Let's plan on it. Let's figure it out. We're going to solve the global problems one watershed at a time, and we have to get the whole watershed right. Now out west, you western producers, that's a single paddock. That's okay. That's okay, because you can fix that whole thing, we know, in a couple of years with your good management. Things move slower where there's less rain. Your regeneration's a little slower perhaps, but we know you can do this. You have the advantage, of course, of you don't have to cooperate as much with other people. I want to get now from the qualitative to the quantitative probably in the next 3 minutes. As Aldo Leopold said in 1949, the consciousness back then, there was something happening. The soil conservation movement was afoot. He said that land then is not merely soil, it is a fountain of energy flowing through a circuit of soils, plants, and animals. It's a qualitative description of one aspect of the functioning of nature. There's more to it, and what we've done with Landstream and this new scale that we've built, this is an early version, but we've come a long way. This is a functional tool. Is we have combined environmental monitoring, environmental modeling, which leads to quantifying really whole landscape function in terms of energy and water budgets, nutrient budget descriptions, and biodiversity being a tack on, although total above ground plant biomass is a critical part of our measurements. Out of that, we get quantified environmental services, a new scale, a new way of measuring what you're producing that benefits, for example, downstream cities. So we're measuring solar and thermal radiation, weather, vegetation, soil properties, infiltration rates, surface water flow and quality, groundwater quality. We put this through these environmental models, we get quantified landscape function, energy, water, and on a qualified basis, nutrient budgets, and we get these quantified environmental services, water purification, groundwater recharge, increased stream base flow, stream cooling, soil carbon increase, which we can definitely measure accurately and at scale, atmospheric gas modulation, reduced flooding, drought, wildfire, dust storms, for example. Project we're working on right now, instrumenting Gabe Brown's ranch, and we'll be sharing this data openly in real time as we build this system. I fly out there in a couple days to do 10 days of soil monitoring. This is a $560,000 project for one section of land, just for a sense of scale. In comparison, edge of field monitoring measuring runoff and runoff volume and water quality on 2 20-acre fields in New England is $450,000. So Gabe has to say we have a worldwide crisis from nitrates in our watersheds to depleted water supplies, flooding, topsoil degradation, desertification, and declining human health. All these things are directly related to ecosystem function, and it's time we quantify our ability to restore that function. Landstream is our best effort, and we want to work with you guys to make this happen. The components of this include advanced soil monitoring, which both is pretty amazing to be able to see in 3D into our soil, but is also the basis for knowing where to put our sensors and to actually do the modeling that scales measurements here and there in a heterogeneous landscape, scale it up properly to the entire landscape. We're looking 4 feet into the soil in this instance, looking at over 40 soil properties, your choice. These mobile flux towers have been the last 3 years of my life. I spent many a late night in a shop building these things, and they work. What they do is they quantify energy and water budgets and above ground plant biomass, and they're a critical component in the whole thing, and we move them around. And finally, and this isn't finally, but one more important piece, is this ability to measure the infiltration rates of our soils. So we put all this together, a whole bunch of science, and we come up with this ability to quantify your total production. I want this to be our near future. I want to end with advice to myself that I'll share with you for what it's worth. That with farmers who can grow topsoil and a way to measure production of environmental services, communities, companies, governments can hire us to grow deep topsoil watersheds. Start with pilot farms wherever we can. Think and plan and hold watersheds, practice and refine regenerative economics, be bold, be loving, learn, cooperate, scale, and grow and pass on a deep topsoil watershed legacy to your kids. Thanks.